record. Okay, so one of the reasons that I founded ARISE was my experiences, my own personal experiences. So I was born and raised in London. And when I was a child, I was really fortunate in that the primary school that I went to, I didn't experience overt racism. And I only remember experiencing racism once, which one could argue is one time too many, which it is. But given the time that was, I think I had a very, very lucky escape. When I got to secondary school, however, my experiences were very different. The racism was almost upsetting. And when I was a teacher as well, I experienced racism from various different angles. I experienced racism from children. I had a 6-year-old call me the N-word one time. I experienced racism from parents, and I experienced racism from colleagues. And so when I left teaching and I went into law, I would have these conversations with my ex-colleagues, and they say, oh, don't you miss teaching and don't you want to go back into teaching? And I said, the only way I will ever find myself in a school again is if something changes with regards to the racism. So that's how I ended up founding ARISE. And this is what I pretty much do all the time. But enough about me. We are not here to talk about me. We are here to talk about race and how to have those conversations with your children. So the session overview for today is we're going to do a little introduction and discuss why it's important to have these conversations. And then we're going to go on to look at talking about race with children aged 4 to 7 and talking about race with children aged 8 to 11. Now, I appreciate that this is a junior school and perhaps you don't have children who are as young as 4, but I think it's really important to get a wider age range into this conversation so that you can decide based on your child's maturity what type of conversation that you would like to have. So these ages are kind of like a rough guidance. So if you have, for example, a 10-year-old who is quite immature and may not be able to handle very in-depth conversations about race and racism, then perhaps you want to take tips from other sections of the webinar. After that, we're going to have a Q&A session, and then we are going to wrap it up and I'll let you go and enjoy your evenings. But that's kind of the overall structure for this evening. Now, before we start this, it's really, really important to remember several things. You being here is absolutely wonderful and fantastic. And I think you need to give yourselves a pat on the back for turning up. Turning up is difficult for many people. When I do these webinars and when I go to schools all over the place, sometimes we have a huge kind of outcome of people. And a lot of the times it's people who have already started to have conversations about race and racism or are aware of issues surrounding race and racism. So I'm almost preaching to the converted. So if you are in that camp, that's absolutely fantastic. And I'm so, so glad that you are showing up and you want to learn more. If, however, you think this is kind of all, what do they say, woke nonsense, I really, really urge you to kind of just bear with me for at least the next hour, if not the next couple of weeks. And hopefully I will have changed your mind by the end of all the webinars. But one of the most important things is, other than showing up, is remembering these. Your child is watching you. I cannot tell you how many times as a teacher I had children, or I experienced children coming into school and saying things that were, racist, sexist, homophobic, or just very mature for their age. And almost every single time it was something that they had learned from home. And that's how it works. You will say something and you won't necessarily think your child is listening, but they are. And they're like sponges. And because you are mum or dad or auntie or uncle or main caregiver, they look up to you and they take their lead from you. So it's really important to remember that you need to not only just kind of turn up to these you need to actually live this. This is not just about, reading the book and checking the boxes. You've got to live this, and it needs to be almost like a 24/7 thing. The conversations as well that you are having with your children should be ongoing. So another thing that I tend to see with not just parents, but schools as well, is that conversations around race and racism and anti-racism tend to be quite reactive. So it will take something really big and awful happening in the news for people to say, oh, actually, maybe I need to have this conversation with my child. And actually, I think it's quite triggering and quite upsetting for children to have to witness something unpleasant on TV for that to spur a conversation. I think these conversations should be ongoing, and they shouldn't kind of just be in reaction to something that's happening in the news, and then you never really talk about it until the next big thing happens in the news. The final thing that I think is important to note is the fact that you can have these conversations early. And when I say early, I mean literally toddler early. It's really important to have conversations with your little ones. But if you haven't had those conversations with your children, please don't panic and feel, you know, the end is nigh and I've done a terrible job. You haven't. You absolutely haven't, and it's not too late. So I would just bear all of these things in mind when it comes to your anti-racism journey. Now, you might be wondering why we should even bother having these conversations, because maybe this generation growing up, Generation Alpha, I think they call the children at school, are, you know, they're colorblind and they don't see race, and they're so much better than baby boomers and generation whatever it is. And yes, to an extent, I think that's very true. I think the generations coming up, as in Generation Z, teenagers and kind of people in their early 20s, and Generation Alpha, I think they are very different to, for example, my generation. However, that doesn't mean that we should kind of leave them to their own vices, and they can, you know, we shouldn't have these conversations. The reason we have to have these conversations is because we need to prepare them for the real world, and we want them to be actively anti-racist. And when I say actively anti-racist, I mean what I said a minute ago, i.e., you're not just saying I'm not racist, and you don't just believe in yourself I'm not racist, because that's really easy to do. Saying it is very easy. Living it is something very different. And we want to give them the tools to live that in their everyday life and to be actively anti-racist. And by virtue of that, be global citizens, i.e., go anywhere in the world and get on with everyone, and, you know, be curious about the world and want to know about what is out there. Another reason we should be having these conversations is that if we don't, race becomes taboo and things will never change. So if you are kind of committed to silence, you're upholding silence, and nothing will change. The world will never ever change if we don't talk about things that are problematic. I always say to people, you know, when has that ever worked in life? When has it ever been the case that if you ignore something enough, that's a problem, it will just simply disappear? We all know life doesn't work like that. And I think this is applicable to talking about anti-racism as well. Another reason why you should be talking about race is that some people don't have a choice. When I say that, I mean people of color. So people who are Black, like myself, people who are brown. Most often than not, we are forced to have conversations about race really early on in life because we've experienced it really early on in life. And I always think to myself, if a 3-year-old can experience racism, then surely another 3-year-old can be told, actually, that's not right. That's not the way you behave. Don't be racist. So people of color cannot have these conversations alone. And as easy as it is, and as much as we want to protect our children and say, oh no, they're too young for that, and I want to maintain their innocence, again, there's an imbalance there, because there are some children who have experienced it, and that's a really terrible thing. Therefore, I think if there are children who have experienced it, the least other people can do is talk to their children about it. They're not experiencing it themselves, but they are just learning about it within a safe space. And to an extent, that's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to talk about it nicely and safely rather than experience it. Finally, the conversations that we have at home and in our communities are super important. They are incredibly important. As I said, and as Mike said at the beginning, it's great that, you know, we are going to be doing some work workshops at schools, and schools are doing all sorts of things with regards to anti-racism, but that can only take you so far. When a child is at home, they need to be hearing the same messages and receiving that same consistency. Now, people might be thinking, well, I don't actually think it's important to talk about race and racism because children don't see race. And actually, research has showed that children do see racial difference, and they begin to see it surprisingly young. So according to Professor Apfelbaum, who is a professor of sociology at Boston University, he found that children start to pick up differences in skin color from about the age of 6 months, which is, of course, very, very small. And they can start to recognize these differences. And whilst we might want to say, oh, well, you know, that's physical differences. Yes, they can see those physical differences. But eventually, as they get older and they become toddlers, they might start to pick up on social cues and social differences between how people of different skin colors are seen and valued and treated. So you may be thinking, but my child's not like that. We're not like that. We don't see color. And again, let me just say, I'd like to think that that's quite a well-meaning thing to say, that you're not like that. And as a family, you might think you're not like that. And you probably aren't like that, being racist. But to say that you don't see color fundamentally is quite a problematic thing to say and think. And that's the first concept that I want to look at today. The concept of saying things like, I don't see color, we don't see color, my child doesn't see color, is something called color blindness. Now, I don't love the term, I have to say. I think it's quite ableist and it's not the greatest terminology, but it's something that many academics within this space use, so I'm going to adopt it as well. And color blindness is basically comments like, oh, I don't see race, and I don't see the difference between different skin colors, and I don't think racism is that bad. So you're essentially denying what is reality. And you might think that's a really helpful approach, but actually it isn't. And the reason is, first of all, it's just not true. When children go to school the first time they go to nursery or kindergarten or playgroup, they are taught what? They're taught shapes, they are taught size, difference in size, and they are taught colors. And within that, they do start to see skin color. So when I was working in early years, many years ago, early years being nursery and reception over here, which I don't think it's called reception in Scotland, but age 4 and 5, children would come up to me almost weekly and put their arm next to mine and say, Miss Lawton, your skin is dark and my skin is light. And Miss Lawton, you have the same skin color as this child. And they would see it and they would comment on it all the time. And it wasn't in a problematic way. It was actually in quite an endearing way. So I don't think we should start to hush children who make those kind of differences and say, oh no, you mustn't say that, that's really rude. It's not, it's the truth. What's slightly different is treating people badly because of their skin color. So saying I don't see skin color is a very different statement to I don't treat people badly because of their skin color. And that's what you want to teach children. You can see it, and it's good to see it, and it's good to acknowledge it, because difference in skin colors is a great thing, but it's important not to treat people badly because of it. So very, very different statements. And we want to go with I don't treat people badly because of the color of their skin. What else is wrong with colorblindness? Well, by ignoring it and denying it, we're not really educating children in the way racial inequalities work. Children start to really, really see and acknowledge that there are racial inequalities when they get to primary school age, and they start to learn about it. They learn about all sorts of things, like the transatlantic slave trade and civil rights movements and so on and so forth. And it's really important that they recognize why that's happening, to kind of say, oh, well, you know, that has happened and that happens for reasons other than the obvious is unfair on them. And it's also, again, not true. So we don't want to invalidate people's past experiences or present experiences. As well, colorblindness not helpful because it's so dismissive, and it really shuts down important conversations. So the example that I gave you a moment ago of young children aged 4 or 5 coming to me and saying, Miss Lawton, our skin is the same, or our skin is different. I always thought those are really nice segues into some good conversations. I would never get upset by it, and usually another child on the receiving end wouldn't be upset either. So if it was me and I was being compared to another Black child, the other Black child would actually be really proud and say, yeah, me and Miss Lawton are twins and we're the same. And I think that's really nice for their self-esteem. And of course, we don't want children kind of going around saying it all the time, but children don't tend to become preoccupied with things like that if you normalize it. If you normalize these kind of conversations and you say, yes, that is a fact. Yes, those two people have the same skin color and that's great. Then they don't tend to become, unhealthily obsessed or interested in such things. It's important that we teach them to have sensible and kind of controlled conversations that are not taboo and aren't based on something really terrible that's happened in the world. And when we do that, children become more socially aware, which is great. And they become more empathetic, which again is something that we really want. We want children to recognize that actually in life, not everybody does have the same opportunities, or not everybody is treated exactly the same. So it's really, really important to move away from that concept and idea of color blindness and just saying, well, we don't see it and I don't want my child to see it, and move more towards actually we do see it and they do see it and that's okay. And we're going to have a conversation about it and then we are going to move on. Now, let me just kind of clear something up. As I said a moment ago, you might be worried and start to think, oh my goodness, but if we have these conversations, my child is going to be walking down the street and pointing at people and saying, you look like this and you look like that. And actually, in all my time working with children, I've never known a child to behave in that way with regards to race and anti-racism. Children are super resilient. I know we want to protect our children and I know we want the best for them, but they are so resilient, and you can tell a child, actually, yes, this person speaks a different language, or this person has a different religious belief, and they will process it and they will accept it and they'll keep moving with life. They don't have, especially when they're really little, they don't have the best memories. So a lot of the time it will just be a case, we'll have this conversation and then they will kind of move on and forget about it or bring it up later on, but it won't become a daily thing where they are now kind of problematically obsessed with differences between people's skin colors. If you don't talk about it now, it will become really problematic later on in life. And I can say that from my own personal experiences, as I didn't say this earlier, but I don't ever remember being in primary school and talking about differences in skin color and hair texture. And we didn't even really talk about religious differences. I went to a Catholic school and all we learned about was Catholicism. And when I got older and I went to a non-Catholic school, I was meeting people from all over the world with different beliefs, and I didn't know anything about their beliefs. And I remember feeling very stupid, I'll be honest with you. And it wasn't problematic. I didn't have biases towards these other groups, but I was definitely ignorant. And I don't think that's a good thing to be at all, not in secondary school anyway. So I think now, when they are little, is the time to have these conversations and really prepare them for the big wide world. They also tend to like having these conversations. That's another thing that I've noticed. Children like it and appreciate it when you treat them with a little bit more credit than you might not always necessarily give to them. So talking to them about things that might seem grown up, but in an appropriate way. And this is one of those things. You tell a child, look, this is what is happening in the news and this is why it's happened. They tend to be really engaged, and it's a good opportunity for them to kind of think critically about who they are as a person and what's going on in the world and who they want to be as a person. And finally, if you yourself model tolerance, as I said earlier on, model tolerance and understanding and celebration of different types of people, be that religious differences or be that based on skin color, then your child is going to pick up on it, and they're not going to become preoccupied by it if you are not preoccupied by it. I want to talk about another kind of phenomenon when it comes to anti-racism, and that is guilt and shame. Guilt and shame. Anti-racism is not for the faint-hearted. I'll tell you that right now. It's not a tick box exercise. It's not one of those things that you can just, you know, turn up today and then never really think about it. And I hope that's not what happens. And sometimes when you are having discussions about anti-racism, it's easy to feel personally guilty, and it's easy to feel ashamed, especially if you recognize what are labeled as problematic behaviors as things that you have done in the past or things that you do in the present. But this is a learning experience. The whole point of this webinar is not to shame anybody or to make anybody feel guilty. The point of this webinar is to teach people. And how do you learn? Well, you learn by making mistakes and fixing them. So if you have made a mistake, then you've made a mistake. But it's important not to kind of wallow or just kind of sit there in the guilt and not do anything about it. The thing is to do something about it. And this is what you need to give to your children as well. So if they've made a mistake, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, it's really important not to kind of straight away jump to their defense and say, no, it could never be my child. My child would never say something like that. How dare you accuse my child of being racist? As parents, we want our children to be perfect and we want them to be good human beings, but they are children. They mess up, they make mistakes. And part of them growing is literally just saying, look, you said something that is not very nice, and you said something that isn't very helpful, isn't true, isn't kind. This is the reason why you should say it. And moving forward, I hope you behave differently. That's how you help your child grow. As somebody who's worked with children all my adult career, I have to say it's incredibly unhelpful when there's a problem, and racism aside, just the most basic problem, and you confront a parent and say, look, this is the problem, and the parent doesn't want to hear it. They go straight into defense mode, and it's, how dare you, and you're a terrible teacher, and I'm going to pull them out of this school, and you can never say that, and my child would never. When actually, most people who work in education, myself included, want the best by your children. You want the best for your children, and part of that is sometimes telling them that they've done something that isn't great. So bear all of that in mind and work with your children to kind of those emotions. How do I have these sorts of conversations? Well, there are many ways to have these conversations. One of the ways you can have these conversations about race is by using books. And later on in the session, I am going to give you some book lists, and I'm going to tell you about some really, really good child-friendly and age-appropriate books that you can use to start the conversations. But there are things that you can do without spending money and without using books. The first thing that you can do with regards to having a good conversation with your child about race is to educate yourself. It's really important that you yourself are racially literate and know what you are talking about before you start kind of passing anything on to your children. When I say racially literate, I mean, I'm not saying you need to kind of become an expert in anti-racism, but just knowing kind of the basic things and basic terminology and what to say and what not to say. And we're going to talk about that now. So one of the first things that I find very, very important when you're talking to your children about anti-racism is the use of the term difference and diversity. So it's really, really good to say, yes, people have differences and there is diversity in the world, but it's really important not to label any one particular group as the diversity. So diversity, when we're talking about human beings, it doesn't mean white and then everybody else is the diversity. Diversity is the mix of everybody together. So that includes white people. And so it's really, really important that you're careful when you're using the term diverse, who you are referring to. It's just something that we use to describe a mix of and multiculturalism and everybody kind of together. It's not, you know, this person is brown, therefore they're the diversity, or that person's black and they're the diversity, or that person is from a minority ethnic background, therefore they're the diversity. So just be careful with that, because that's what we call othering language. And othering is exactly what it says on the tin, making somebody feel that they are the other, that one group is kind of the prototype, and then everybody who doesn't fit into that prototype is an other. And that can be really upsetting for children, because they don't want to be the ones who are kind of standing out or the other. Nobody wants to be the other. It's not a nice feeling. It's not a welcoming feeling. So just be careful with that. Another thing with regards to language is that people can find it very difficult to use certain adjectives to describe certain skin colors. And what I mean by that is, for example, being afraid to use the term black. Now, I don't think anybody should be afraid to use that term. If you were describing me, for example, and you were to describe me and you'd say, you know, she's got curly hair and she's wearing a pink jumper, I wouldn't find it problematic if you said she's a black woman, because it's a very neutral description of who I am. And it's a fact, I am black. And I think it's important to take the taboo away from words like black, because some people really panic, don't they? They say, oh, you can't say that, and that's really bad. Why can't you say it? It's a fact, okay? If a person is black, they are black. And again, let's not attach negative feelings to a word when you are not meaning it in a negative way. So actually, I think use terminology, say that person, you know, the little black boy over there, if you are describing them in a neutral way, say the little white girl over there, if you need to, and there's absolutely no other way to describe them, of course, you don't always have to go to race, but if you're saying it in a very neutral term where you're just kind of innocently describing someone, by all means, say it. There is, however, a big difference between saying, you know, oh, the black lady with the pink jumper versus something really negative, such as England lost the Euros in 2021 because of the black players. So can you see there's a difference there? One is very neutral and just casual, and you're not meaning anything negative by it. You are genuinely just innocently making a description, versus the other, which has something super negative attached to it and also has nothing. The color of a football player's skin has absolutely nothing to do with anything. So that's where you need to be careful. And it's important to teach our kids the difference between those things. Casually and innocently and nicely describing someone where it's relevant and where it makes a difference to the conversation, or where it helps the conversation, where it adds to a conversation, versus saying it for the sake of it, where it adds nothing to the conversation, doesn't make any sense, and is problematic and therefore racist. So it's really important to teach your children the difference between the two. Let's talk about language some more, and let's talk about bad language. So one of the things that I see all the time, and I hear all the time when I go to schools, is the use of racial slurs. And this is not so much with the little ones. I've never known the really little kind of 3, 4, 5-year-olds to say it. It's very common though in the older ones, and I mean 9, 10, 11 plus. In between those ages, every now and then you do get it, but 9, 10, 11 plus are the age groups that I've personally seen it in many times. And the thing is, at that age, most of them, even though they shouldn't be, and even though they say they're not, are on social media or have access to the internet in some way. And they are consuming a lot of pop culture, and they're consuming, you know, videos from all over the world, and they play online gaming, and they're connected. And that's fine as long as they do it safely. But you have no control over everything that they consume. And so a lot of the time they come across videos that are really racist, comments in YouTube sections that are really racist, TikToks that are racist, comments on TikToks that are racist. I mean, just last week I was in a school and a 10-year-old boy told me that he does online gaming. And there was some really, really horrible stuff in there about Indian people, and people in this online group were just being very, very racist. So it's things like that. And I think it's important to have those conversations with your children if you allow them to use the internet in that way. And it's simple. All you have to do is tell them that, yes, you can use the internet, but just remember there are people out there who make the wrong choices, and people who will say things that are racist, and people who make racist comments, and people who will post racist things. And it's important for you to never engage in that kind of behavior. What you can do if you see that kind of behavior online is report it. Physically use the report button on YouTube, or give it a thumbs down on not Instagram, TikTok, for example. You can report it in that way. But don't get into a back and forth with a stranger on the internet with regards to racism. And if they ask you, well, why can't I do that? I want to stand up for myself, or I want to do this. Remind them of the fact that the internet is a really big place. And there are some people out there and you don't know what they're capable of. And so actually it's safer to either just report it or go and find an adult if you're not sure how to deal with it. Another thing with regards to kind of pop culture consumption is music that children listen to. And something that comes up a lot is the use of the N-word in genres such as hip hop and R&B. And many people don't understand why some people do use the N-word, some Black people do use the N-word, but say that others aren't allowed to use it. And I understand why that can be confusing, because it seems hypocritical, but history is super important within the context of this. The N-word is a terrible, terrible word, obviously. The history is absolutely horrible. It stems back hundreds of years and comes from kind of colonialism and transatlantic slave trade. And it was a word used to describe people as being subhuman and less than, and kind of just an awful human being. As the years went on, some Black people decided to say, hey, wouldn't it be really funny if this word that's been used to kind of talk down on us and oppress us, wouldn't it be really funny if we used it amongst ourselves as a joke? And that's how some Black people started to reclaim that word. And for me personally, I don't use the word. I don't like the word. It just doesn't sit right with me. I've been called it many times and it upsets me, so I don't want to use it myself. But I can understand why somebody would want to take ownership of it and reclaim it as their own. My job, I can never tell another Black person that they cannot use the N-word, because it's not my job to police people in that way. And I don't have the right to tell anybody else how to use that word. What I can do, however, is kind of put a public service announcement out there to say that if you are not a member of a certain community, you never ever get to use a slur against that community. So if you are not Black, you don't get to use the N-word. It's just one of those things. And sometimes, again, children don't understand this, and I don't blame them. It's very nuanced, but always to say to them, why would you want to use that word? If they're saying, oh, but you know, so-and-so is Black and they say it at school, and I listen to this person on the radio or on Spotify and they say it in their apps, ask them why they would want to say a word that has such a horrible history. The same with other racial slurs or any type of slur, be that a homophobic slur, a sexist slur, whatever it is. Why would you want to say it? What possible reason could you have for saying it? In school, luckily, we have rules. And so I think within school walls, nobody should be able to say it. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a member of that community, nobody should be able to say those sorts of words in schools, because it's swearing at the end of the day. It's swearing, it's bad language, and that's not allowed. But explain to your children that words have meanings and words have history. And a lot of the meaning and the history behind it is very, very racist. And there's no reason to want to say that word. And so they shouldn't say that word. If they are singing along to their favorite song, it's so easy to kind of redact the word or just not sing it. Okay, I've seen it. There have been times, not in a very long time, but I remember going out years ago, and a song came on the radio in this bar, and lots of people singing it, and it had the N-word in it, and nobody sang it. Not a single white person in that room sang it. They just kind of muted themselves for that period, for that word, and then they carried on singing. And I thought, you know what? It's so easy to do that. It's so easy. In the same way that I am not a member of the Asian community. I am not Indian. I am not, I'm not Bangladeshi. I'm not a member of the Asian community in any way, shape, or form. And therefore, things like the P word, if there were songs that had the P word in it, would I use them? No, I wouldn't, because it's not my word. And I don't have the right to use that word. And the only reason why somebody could possibly want to use that word is to be racist. So just explain to them, some words are really racist and really, really horrible. Some people say them because that's their word and it's within their community. But you don't get to say that word because it's a really, really horrible word and you don't want to say things like that. So that's really another very important conversation to have with children. And we're going to talk about that a tiny bit more, not in next week's seminar, but the seminar after, when we talk about standing up against racist bullying and racist comments and things like that. In terms of racial literacy, there are so many books out there that you can use. One of them is actually called Bringing Up Race, How to Raise a Kind Child in a Prejudiced World. And it's an amazing book. I devoured it very, very quickly. And the other one is called Wish We Knew What to Say, Talking with Children About Race. And it breaks down having these conversations into kind of different age groups and things like that. These are two brilliant books. If you can get hold of them, please try and get hold of them. At the end of this webinar, I am going to send a book list for you to read. And my book lists are kind of split up into two different age groups. So there are book lists for young children, book lists for junior school children, teenage children if you've got teenagers, and book lists for adults. Moving on. As I said, having these conversations can be as simple as just having a very casual conversation about difference. And that's really good for the little ones, talking about difference. And you can do that quite easily. You can do that by pointing out differences in the most kind of mundane thing in the world. You can talk about differences in objects around the room. So, what color is this and what color is that, and which one is bigger and which one is smaller, and are they all the same? No, they're not all the same. You can talk about difference in nature, which is a really lovely thing to do, just talking about different shapes of plants and flowers and trees. But the point is, you're kind of building up to have a bigger conversation about differences in human beings. Now, there is a book called Racism, and it's by a lady called Anita Ganeri. And I would recommend it. It's on the book list. There are two other books that deal with this topic really well. And the second one is called Racism and Intolerance, you can see here, by Louise Spielberry and Hanan Kai. And then the final one is called What is Racism by Katie Danes and Jordan Akpojaro. And within these books, I've kind of collated the points that I think are really, really good to talk to your children about. And I'm just going to quickly go through them. So if you're not sure where to start when it comes to talking about difference, you can talk about differences in clothes. Okay, so talk about the fact that people wear different clothes, and talk about the fact that people have different religious headwear, and people speak different languages, and people have different accents, and talk about the fact that we live in different ways. So that's a really nice way to introduce the concept of difference to the little ones. And then you can go on to say, even though we're all different and we're all human, we should be respectful to each other, and we should treat everybody fairly and equally. And moving on from that, you can start to talk about concepts surrounding how people don't always treat those with differences nicely. And you can say it in a way like this: sometimes people are treated differently because of the color of their skin, their family background, the country they come from, and this is called racism. And you can explain, if they ask what's racism, this is a really nice way, apologies, it's been cut off slightly, but it says racism is a form of prejudice. And prejudice is when someone dislikes someone else from another group or for a particular group of people without even knowing them. Imagine disliking someone before you've even had a conversation with them or you've even gotten to know them. That wouldn't be fair. And this is actually something that I do in the workshops with when I go to schools and I work with young children, and they are so outraged by the idea of prejudice. And I say, wouldn't it be ridiculous if you decided that you didn't like someone and it was for no reason? You just looked at them and you just decided, I don't like that person, even though you don't know them. And they really just go absolutely, they just get very upset at that. And that's good, because it shows that they have empathy and they understand how ridiculous prejudice is. Talk about things like tolerance and intolerance, but again, be careful about the language here. So actually, I don't love the term tolerate, because in my mind, tolerate means reluctantly put up with something. So I prefer the term celebrate, but this is just what was in the book. So celebrate the fact that people have different ways of life, and celebrate the fact that there are so many different languages and accents and nationalities, and that is a wonderful thing. You can also just ask your children questions like these. If we look at these post-its over here, you can ask them things like, what would you do if you saw someone being treated differently because of the way they look? And again, you don't need to straight away go in there and start relating it to race. You can build it up and you can say, what would you do if somebody just said, I don't like you because you've got blonde hair, or I don't like you because you've got brown hair? And wouldn't it be really awful if someone just decided all people with, green eyes have to be treated differently? And again, that's how they start to realize how silly racism as a concept is. And then once they've kind of understood it on a very kind of surface level, as in, with reference to hair colors and eye colors, then you can start bringing in skin color and say, wouldn't it be really ridiculous if people just said, you have to sit over there because of your skin color, or you need to sit over here because of your skin color? And that's how you can start to get into a conversation about race and skin color. Moving on slightly, the terms race and racism. Some people say when I do these seminars, like these webinars or other, oh, but at what age should I be using the terms race and racism? I think it's very, very individual, as in, your child and what they can understand and what they can't understand, what they can handle and what they can't handle. Race as a concept isn't actually a negative thing to be able to deal with or to handle. And you can just tell them really, really simply that actually race just means this. If we look over at the yellow post-it, race just means different people with skin color, with the same skin colors. And actually, it was made up. Somebody decided that humans needed to be split up into little groups. And they decided that these groups would be based on skin color. So white people, or people with white skin, people with black skin, people with brown skin. And actually, to an extent, historically, that people were described as having red and yellow skin. And just explain to them that that humans really aren't different, and there's one human race, but there is an idea that races are different skin colors within humanity. And again, if they ask questions about that, like how many races are there? Explain that to them. There's one human race, but people within the human race all look different. Doesn't mean that we should be treated differently, or it doesn't mean that people should be treated differently, but people within the human race all look different. And if they are a very curious child and say to you, well, why do people look different? You can say, because of genes. And this is where things get scientific and cool. And actually, this book here, What is Racism, by Katie Danes and Jordan Akpajara, there are two versions of that book. And one of them is this huge hardback, and it's like a lift the flap book. And it's so, so cool. I love this kind of stuff. It's a really cool book where it will explain a concept like genes and genetics. You lift the flap and it has kind of like a little diagram of DNA and things like that. And you can, it's just a very, very good book. So I would highly, highly recommend that one. But if your child asks, why do people look different? Explain to them that it's genes, and genes carry information about what you look like. And they determine whether you're going to have straight hair or curly hair or blue eyes or brown eyes or whatever it is. And they also determine your skin color. If they ask, well, why do people have different skin colors? Explain the idea of melanin to them. I think it's really, really important that children know from a young age that it's literally just melanin. And for those who don't know, melanin is a chemical. And people who are historically, whose ancestors came from hotter countries and hotter continents, such as Africa and Asia and South America and North America, actually, and so on and so forth, needed melanin to protect them from the sun. So melanin is the chemical that prevents you from getting sunburn. And so if someone's ancestors came from such a place, they needed more melanin. And because of how genes work, it was passed on from their ancestor to their children and their children and their children and their children. And that's how genes and inheritance work. On this post-it down here, I've got a little thing about why people have different hairstyles, and this is different hair textures, I should say. This is, I think, another thing that's really important to discuss with children, because I found that when it comes to children saying things that are racist, one of the things that they tend to go for is hair texture as well. So do have those conversations about the fact that people do have different hair textures, and really celebrate the fact that people have different hair textures. And again, if they ask, well, why does somebody have so-and-so in my class have afro hair? Or why does someone have really big curly hair and I don't? I have long and straight hair. Explain to them it's about genes again, and about your pores and about curl patterns and things like that. You do not have to memorize all of this, by the way. If you're frantic, I can see someone frantically taking notes, but please don't worry, I will give you a copy of this. So if you want these answers, you can kind of refer back to them. Again, please don't worry. Let's move on. But the point of this is to kind of really get some ideas of how you can explain racism to your children, and how you can explain skin color and hair textures and languages and genetics and things like that. Again, these books, very, very good. As I said, you might not have children who are aged 4 to 7, but I'm going to go with this anyway, because it's really important that you decide how you kind of gauge this conversation with your child. These are not prescriptive ages. So I'm not saying that if your child is 11, you cannot use things from this section of the webinar and apply it to them. As I said earlier, it's really, really important to have conversations around diversity when they are young. And again, thinking back to the slides that we just looked at, talking about difference, okay, to have those conversations with them. You don't necessarily have to apply it to race immediately, but eventually build up to talking about differences in skin color. Again, we don't want to other anyone else or say, oh, that person is, you know, different in this way, and whatever it might be, but just introduce the idea to them very, very gently. Okay, brilliant. We've got some parents of young children in here. So again, gentle introductions to the idea of difference. Apply it to things that you see in everyday life, things that you see around you. Apply it to shape, to size, and to color of objects and humans. Books, as I said before, books are such a great way to have conversations with your little ones with regards to race and anti-racism. Now, this is not the book list that I will be sending you after the session. The book list that I will be sending you after the session is pages long. It's very, very long. And as much as I'd love to kind of talk you through every single book on that list, we'd be here until midnight. So I've just kind of picked the ones that I think are really good for introducing the topic of racism to your little ones. So the first is Two Eyes, a Nose and a Mouth. Really good picture book. And it talks about differences in human beings and how wonderful it is that humans are all different and things like that. A is for Activist is a really, really nice book. It's a hardback, and it goes through the alphabet. So it says things like A is for activism, and B is for bravery, and C is for, I can't remember off by heart, but it's something like that. Great book. Great book. Color of People. Another one, it's a picture book, really, really good, and looks at people of all different skin colors, really good stuff. Mixed is a really, really important one, because I find that a lot of the time when it comes to anti-racism and things like that, sometimes people of mixed heritage are left out, and it's very much kind of, you are either this race or you are that race. And I find it quite unusual, at least before, not so much recently, because more authors are publishing books about, you know, children of mixed heritage. But for a very long time, children of mixed heritage were left out, which I don't think is helpful. And again, this is something to talk to your children about. It's very, very possible to be of mixed heritage. And again, it's wonderful. You could have a mum who is Black and a dad who is white. You can have a mum who's mixed race and a dad who's Asian, and just introduce the idea of being mixed race. Okay, so that's a good one. The Crayon Box That Talked, also a very, very good book, all about kind of differences and, you know, the importance of different crayons doing different jobs. So it's all about kind of the idea of some people are good at this and other people are good at that. Very, very nice. Elmer by David McKee is an absolute classic. Elmer the Patchwork Elephant. David McKee, who sadly passed away in April of this year, he had a daughter who was mixed race, and she used to have really negative experiences with regards to racism in school. And he wrote Elmer for her, and it was all about, you know, celebrating your skin color. So that's probably my favorite one, I have to say, because I remember that from when I was a little girl. Lovely, lovely book. Happy in Our Skin is great. It's all about kind of instilling confidence in your children and being happy in their skin. And it talks about treating other people really nicely and looking at things like, it has these pages with different scenarios on them. And for example, on one page, there's a picture of a girl, an Asian girl, and some children are pointing at her and laughing at her, and she's crying. And it asks you to think, how do you think this girl is feeling? And why do you think they're laughing at her? And how would you feel if it was you? So it's a really good one. Amazing Grace by Mary Hoffman is an oldie but a goodie. It is about a young Black girl called Grace, and she decides to audition for the part of Peter in Peter Pan. And somebody at her school says, you can't be Peter because you're Black. Peter Pan is white. So it actually has racism within the storyline. And I'm sure, don't quote me on this, but I'm sure Mary Hoffman actually uses the word racist and racism in the book. I'm sure of it, but I need to double check on that. That's a really good one as well. Racism by Anita Guarneri, as I said earlier, those are the ones that I was referring to. It's a tiny little picture book like that. Very good stuff. And then our Lift the Flap book is called What is Racism? By Katie Danes and Jordan Akpajaro. So those are just a kind of snippet of a couple of books that I would highly, highly advise you borrow from your library, or if you can buy them, then that would be great to have at home. Now let's talk a bit more about children aged 8 to 11. And there's a big difference between the ones who are kind of 3 years old, 4 years old, and the ones who are in junior school, 8 years old and above. And that's because by that age, they've been exposed to a bit more, obviously, and their life experiences are slightly different. And by that age, I find that they tend to know when racism is happening. They just might not necessarily know that it's called racism, and they might still feel a little bit uncomfortable in talking about it. And that's totally normal. So if your child is that age and they get really, really uncomfortable and squirmish talking about it, then don't panic. What I would say is that I would remind them that actually it's important to talk about this, and it's important to talk about it so that we know how to fix it, and it's important to talk about it so that we can, change the world and make the world a safer and better place for everyone. But just allow your children to take their time, even the little ones. these conversations are not they're not lectures. I'm by no stretch of the imagination do I suggest kind of formally sitting your child down with slides like this and saying, well, this is the definition of racism. It's about doing it quite casually. If you want to have a formal sit down with them, that's absolutely fine. But I think little and often is better than nothing at all, and is also better than, right, we're going to sit down and talk about this one time and then we're never going to talk about it ever again. But back to ages 8 to 11. It's really important that at this age, they know that it's more than just kind of leaving your friends out of a game or pointing and laughing at someone. They should know that it is verbal and it is physical, but you should also start talking about the fact that it is against the law. So one of the bonuses of kind of having two hats as a lawyer and as a teacher is that when I go to schools, we talk about the age of responsibility. And we talk about the fact that actually, not only is it wrong to behave in this way, but in many places around the world it's illegal. And there are people out there and organizations who are working to make sure that actually people do not behave in that way. Also start to explain to them that sometimes it can be really, really insidious, especially the ones who are kind of nearing secondary school age. Again, based on the conversations that I've had with children that age, they know about things like the Black Lives Matter movement. They remember it from 2020, and they will tell me, they will bring it up. I don't tend to bring that up in my sessions. They will bring it up and they will tell me things that they've seen on social media. And it's important to explain to them that, yeah, you know what, sometimes that does happen. Sometimes you get people out there who are racist and do make poor decisions in their jobs and make poor decisions in their personal lives and so on and so forth. Feelings, because children are more able to articulate their feelings at that point as well. I think it's really important to encourage them to tell you how they're feeling. If they're feeling terrified and embarrassed and ashamed or whatever it is, then let them feel that, and they can sit in that feeling for a while, but eventually encourage them, to put that feeling behind them and move forward. So we don't want to kind of, shame them terribly if they have done something racist or they've said something racist or they're thinking something. At this age, I would take it more of a learning opportunity than a shaming opportunity, because if they genuinely don't know better, then that's their opportunity to learn. If they do know better, then that's slightly different, and maybe you need to consider dealing with it in a different way. But again, we will talk about that in 2 weeks' time. Now, common forms of racism in children. This is not an exhaustive list of every single racist thing a child has ever done in the history of the world, but these are very common examples that I've seen working in schools and doing workshops and things like that. And this list applies to children from as young as 3 all the way up to teenagers. And it's things like telling jokes about people from certain groups, making fun of people's accents, making fun of their names, refusing to pronounce their name properly, making fun of the food somebody has in their lunchbox if it's not something that they recognize, making fun of somebody's cultural clothes, religious headwear, or religious jewelry, religious, tattoos or markings and things like that, making fun of their appearance, stereotyping people from different cultural groups, refusing to sit with someone or be in the same team as someone because they've got a different skin color, hair type or texture, religion, faith, beliefs, or they speak a different language, and excluding children from play and friendship groups. So these are all the sorts of things that I see when we say racism in children. This is the sorts of things that I'm referring to. And it's really important that if your child does these things, you have the confidence to tell them that it's not right. Because again, as I said earlier, it's very easy to kind of get very defensive and say, well, they're only a child. And yes, they're only a child, but as a parent, it's, our job to say, that's not the correct way to behave. and you need to not behave like that. You need to not do that, and give them a reason. Maybe don't give them a reason, but I think children learn more when they understand things. So actually, it's not right to make fun of somebody's name, because a name is a part of someone's identity, and it's special to them, and it's special to their parents or whoever named them, and it's special to their culture. And actually, it might mean the most beautiful thing in the world in another language. We don't know, and it doesn't matter. But you need to be respectful about people's names. Okay, so just explaining why it's wrong rather than just blanket, don't do that, because then that's just a bit of a nag and a telling off, and they don't understand why they are not supposed to behave in this way. But when things like that happen, please, please, please have the bravery to just say, no, we don't say that, and no, we don't behave like that. Please don't do that, and that's not very nice, and that's really not acceptable, and, you know, move forward. I think another thing, I don't know, one of the things that really pops up when I tend to look at this list with parents is some parents say, where did you learn that from? Where did you get that from? And again, it's up to you whether or not you ask your child this question. But regardless of where they learned it from or where they got it from, don't try and talk it away and excuse it and say, oh, well, you'll never hang out with so-and-so ever again if that's the way they behave. Explain to them that actually so-and-so, we'll call them Joe. Joe shouldn't have been making those kinds of jokes. And you should know that you do not make those kinds of jokes, and don't copy what your friends are doing, especially if you don't understand why they're saying it. Because this is another thing. Children tend to say things that they know have a negative connotation, but I'm not sure that they know exactly how bad the word is that they're saying. But yes, in regards to actually getting to the bottom of it, you can ask, but just make sure that you're not kind of just asking and then not dealing with it. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're going to wrap up in a second. But in terms of handling racism, as I said, it's really, really important not to kind of just say, oh, well, you learned it from so, and you didn't get that from this house, and then never kind of have the conversation. Do have the conversation, but don't try and make excuses for them, and don't try and talk away their experiences. So this is something that happens many, many times, where something will happen and a parent will say, oh, well, you know, just ignore them. I don't think that's helpful. I actually don't think we should be ignoring racism at all. We need to have conversations, and if wherever it's happened, whether it's happened at school or at swimming club or at tennis or wherever, have the conversation with the person in charge and take it from there. If your child exhibits racist behavior, don't panic. If it's kind of repeatedly happening, then I would really think about how you're going to deal with it and think about where it's coming from. In that case, it's super important where it's coming from, and how you're going to deal with it. If it's kind of, you know, video games, online gaming rooms, streaming, things like that, then maybe you do want to think about taking that away. But don't forget to sit down and have the conversation with them and explain to them why it's not acceptable behavior and what the implications are. Again, tell your child what is respectful and what is not respectful. Very simple conversation to have. You know, don't say that because that's disrespectful. Don't say that because that's verbally abusive. That's really not a nice thing to say. And again, as I said earlier, have those conversations, create those opportunities, get those books and talk about things like that. Books for the older ones, age 8 and above. Again, these are all on the book list. This is not my exhaustive book list. I'll send it to you later on. But the first one is This Book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Jewell. And I would only recommend this for children aged 10 and up. It's a bit heavy. It's a great book. Don't get me wrong. It's a really great book, but I'm not sure that an 8 or a 9-year-old would get it in the way that somebody who is 10 or 11 might. Can I Touch Your Hair is a really good one. And it's a poetry book about race and making mistakes and friendship. Freedom We Sing is a stunning book. It's a picture book. I do not think there is an age limit. And I don't think children should stop reading picture books just because they can read chapter books. So I would 100% recommend this one. It's a really nice one. I Am Not a Label by Kerry Burnell. Kerry Burnell used to present on CBeebies, and she has, I think, she's missing part of her limb. I'm not sure if she was born with her limb missing or it was an operation. I'm not sure the background there, but she was a presenter on CBeebies a while ago, and she was actually one of the first people I remember seeing on TV who had a visible disability. And this book that she's written, I Am Not a Label, is a book where she talks about people who do have disabilities. And the reason I've included this in the list is because I think that's really, really important. I think it's, if you're having conversations about race and anti-racism, I think you also need to have conversations about the fact that people do have different disabilities, physical or otherwise. And within this book anyway, she talks about lots of famous people from history who have disabilities. And for example, she talks about Stevie Wonder and what it was like for him growing up as a Black disabled boy in America in the 1950s and beyond. So it's a brilliant book all about disabilities. You Must Be Layla is a really nice chapter book. I would recommend this for 7-year-olds and above. And it's about a girl who wears a hijab. And it's just a really lovely book. The Missing by Michael Rosen is a very good one. And it's all about Michael Rosen, the author and poet's experiences, his family's experiences during the Second World War, and how his family were facing persecution for being Jewish. And then the last one on this list is called Front Desk, and it's by Kelly Yang. And I would recommend that for children aged 10 and above. And it's all about a girl who is working in her parents' motel, and they have people who are undocumented migrants turn up at the hotel. And it's all about her looking at her own identity as a Chinese girl. And it just really, really nicely kind of explores the ideas around immigration and migration and belonging. So that's my little list for those aged 8 and above. To kind of wrap up what I've been saying, conversations are really, really important. Be open and be honest in your conversations. Start with yourself and then start to have the conversations with your children. Change is a team effort. So it's not just about people of color who experience racism having the conversations about racism. It's about everybody, whether you experience racism or not. It's about everybody being on the same page and having those conversations with their children. Like I said earlier, having these conversations is important. The conversations that a child has at home, if they are not matching what they're being taught at school, most of the times the conversations at home kind of trump the conversations that are being had at school. And that's when problems start to occur. They need consistency. What's being taught in schools, which is acceptance and celebration, should be mirrored at home as well. Have the conversation. It doesn't need to be formal sit down. It can be very casual. Use the books if you're not sure. You can always ask me. I get emails all the time from people kind of presenting me with scenarios, and they'll say, oh, my child said this or they did this. I am not, you know, the all-knowing kind of beacon of everything anti-racism, but I do have many years experience personally and professionally. So I will always do my best to kind of come up with a solution for you. I am on all of the things. My website is called, my organization rather is called ARISE, Anti-Racism in Schools and Education, in case you missed that at the beginning. My email address is on the screen. If you want to send me an email, please do. That will come directly to me. It won't just kind of get lost in an abyss somewhere. That's my website, theariseproject.org.uk. I am reluctantly on Twitter, I'm reluctantly on Instagram, and I am also reluctantly on LinkedIn if you are so inclined to kind of connect. I do post on those platforms, and I do post kind of resources and games and cool things that you can do with your kids with regards to anti-racism and equality, just very, very reluctantly, because I'm not a very good social media manager, but I try. If you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Please feel free to use the raise hand function. If you don't want to do that, you can send me a direct message. If you don't want to do that either, you can just send me a direct email and we can deal with it together. But do let me know if you've got anything that you want to know. No question.
Mine isn't a question, but just to say thank you so much. It was an excellent session. I do a lot of work in sort of equality, diversity, inclusion in a workplace, but I'm always, even as someone who works there, still with my children, I'm not quite sure, how to have those conversations. So thank you so much. It's been an excellent session.
You're welcome. Matt, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to reiterate Carolyn's thanks. And this has come at a good time, actually. So my little boy is 6 and he's watching a David Beckham program on Disney at the moment about saving a football squad in the East End of London. Mm-hmm. And there's a black boy on the program, and he did this wonderful poem about being black. And he asked me today, why does he keep saying black? What does that mean? And so I had that discussion with him about skin color, and he's actually got a friend in his class who is black, and he said, "Oh, is my friend black?" And I was really worried about having that conversation, because what I didn't want to happen was for my son to start going, "Oh, you're black," and highlighting that difference. But I think this has really sort of showed me actually it's all right to have those conversations and highlight differences, but like you say, not make a big deal about those differences or in a negative way. And so thank you. I was still worried about reinforcing that negative view. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, and actually it's come out a real ideal time. I suppose one of the questions was, and it'll be good to have your insight on this, is we went to see the Scotland-Fiji game, and obviously their skin colour is a mix of brown and black, and he asked me about them, and then he said, "Is my friend from Fiji?" I said, "No, he's from a different. He's from Scotland. I think he was born in Scotland." Mm-hmm. And then it was all about where people are from, and that was a sort of a difficult conversation to have. And unfortunately, we were getting ready for school, so I've never finished that conversation with him. But just about where people are from and their background, I wonder how you tackle that.
Great question. And first of all, you're welcome. Secondly, I am desperate to check out that documentary myself. I might go and do that after this session. But how do you talk about nationalities and differences? Well, I would start by saying, there are people from many different countries all over the world. And one of the really good things about the world we live in today is the fact that people can move around really easily. So sometimes people from different countries come to, I don't know, we'll say London, for example. Sometimes people whose parents or grandparents were born in India, they might have moved to London, and then their family setup is in London, and now their children, their heritage and their background might be in India, but their home, where they grow up, and the language they speak, and the cultures, one of the cultures that they're kind of involved in, it's not really rubbish wording for me, but is London and English. So actually you can be Indian and English, you can be Nigerian and Scottish, you can be Mexican and Irish, or whatever it is. But just, I would kind of tackle it from a way of, people move, or people in different countries have different skin colors, and you can talk about those reasons we talked about before, because of melanin and their heritage and their ancestors. And then also as well, people have moved all over the world. So actually you might find somebody in Edinburgh who's got brown skin, and that's because their parents moved to Scotland, or whatever it might be, their grandparents moved to Scotland, but they're lucky because they've got different heritages. They're Scottish and they're I don't know, Chinese, for example. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. That does help. It helps me frame the discussion that I will want to carry on with him. So it's great. And the documentary is called Saving Our Squad, and it's on Disney Plus.
I'm going to check it out for sure. Thank you, Matt. Do we have any other questions? I'm happy to hold on. Please feel free if you want to disappear. Don't feel that you need to be polite and wait for me, because I can talk for a very long time. We've got something in the chat. The letter. Oh, this is really good. If parents can't find or source some of the book suggestions, the Letterbox library might be a good place to look, as they have lots of inclusive books for all ages from toddlers up. Oh, that's good to know. So there's a little link for you. I'm just actually going to send some of these book lists now in the chat, and then I will also send them to the school, and hopefully they can get them out to you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and let's see if this works. Yes, okay, so if you've got teenagers, I'm sending a book list for you. Let's hope this works. It might be a really massive file and it doesn't actually end up sending, but we'll try. And let's see, do we have book list for the little ones? Yes, we do. Ooh. Has that gone through? Can anybody see in the chat it's called? Okay, great. Then I'll keep doing this. Again, if
looks like that's there, yeah.
If you need to run away.
No, what I wanted to do, Pula, was just to say I mean, I'm conscious there may be a few other questions, so please don't rush away if you do have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for starting the conversation for us. We have been talking about this for some time, but I think you're really starting the conversation at a different level for us, and I'm delighted about that. It's so lovely. I'm excited. I was excited the first time I spoke to you. I'm really excited now, and I can see Mrs. Lydon being very excited as well, because it's lovely to get some answers that help both parents and teachers on this journey together. Fantastic. I'm very excited about this time next week, by which time you come on for the similar webinar. What will have happened is you will have joined us, you will have done an assembly for primary 6, you will have done an assembly for primary 7, you will have done a twilight for staff, and because we're such, we just want to make sure you work all day long, we're going to make sure that you're speaking to lots and lots of children and as many staff as we can get you involved with throughout the day, which I know, and I've heard you saying that you're excited about too, not only because you get to come to Edinburgh. So delighted. I am so excited that that is happening. We are the first Scottish school to have hosted you, so we feel very privileged in that regard. I don't think we'll be the last. I think we'll be the first. And with that, you are going to be at Queensferry Road next Tuesday. However, we are already discussing when you're going to be able to come up to be on the Ravelston site for our youngest children and do a very similar thing. And they're really hoping you'll be involved with our youngest children, staff, and that includes our nursery staff, our support staff, and our E+ team. They're really important. So that is something for us to look forward to. As you said at the beginning, and this is for the parents, as you said at the beginning, if you are on a parents' WhatsApp group or in any of the parental groups and you've enjoyed this, please text your friends, let them know to join in. The recording will be there. If you catch up, presumably before next week, and then come in and join us for next week, because there's 2 more to go. But we have a little bit of a tradition, Pula, that you probably won't be aware of. But at the end of these such seminars, what we like to do is I like to encourage everybody to unmute, turn your camera on if you want to, but don't feel you have to, and to give an ESMS round of applause to Pula. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. That's really
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I will see you all. Thank you so much for having me. And I will see you all same time next Tuesday. So 7 p.m. next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about diversity and making sure that everybody is included and making sure that everybody is represented and everybody feels as though they belong. So I will see you for that seminar webinar next week.
Good.
So much.
Yeah. If you want to give me some details about the venue. Oh.
Right, I'm going to stop recording. Let's see, make sure.